All right, I believe we're recording. Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Amatuzio, and I'm one of the members of the 2020 LakeSmart team with the Lake of the Woods District Stewardship Association. These are my team members.
Hi, I'm Bree.
Hi, I'm Abby.
This month, we've been trying to highlight some of the issues surrounding aquatic invasive species in the Lake of the Woods watershed. We asked you guys on social media some of your questions regarding invasive species, and we contacted an expert to answer all your questions. So please welcome Brook, the Aquatic Program Specialist with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Thanks for joining us today, Brook.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about aquatic invasive species. Obviously, on these crazy times right now, it's nice to be able to, do these types of things to reach Ontario's public. So yeah, as Jordan said, my name is Brook Schryer, and I'm the Aquatic Program Specialist with the Invading Species Awareness Program and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the aquatic invasive species in the Lake of the Woods watershed, and talk about their identification, the impacts that they have on the environment, and some of the things that you can do as members of the public to prevent the spread, as well as report invasive species when you come across them. And I just want to confirm you guys can see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so an overview of what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be about a 30-minute presentation. I'll try to get through as much of this as I can in that amount of time. So who is the OFAH and the Invading Species Awareness Program? What are aquatic invasive species as well as terrestrial invasive species? Then we're going to talk about a few profiles. Now I've only highlighted one of each taxonomic group. So one aquatic plant, one aquatic invertebrate, and one fish. And then I'll show some photos of some of the other species that are found in that region. Then we'll talk about some prevention methods, so some things that people can do, practical things that people can do to try to prevent the spread. And then how to report, which is super important. And then at the end, I believe there are some questions which I will do my best to answer. So this is ISAP. This is the team. Top left, you have Sophie Monfett, who's our fearless leader, and then Allison Morris in the center. She's actually on maternity leave right now. Congrats to her for having another baby boy. In the top right, you have Rob holding a very nasty aquatic invasive plant, which is found in southern Ontario, unfortunately. And Rob has actually been working quite hard over the last 4 or 5 years to manage this plant and hopefully eradicate it someday from Ontario's waters. In the bottom left, you have Chase, who's our comms guy. And as you can see, he's in the wild there behind his computer screen doing some social media posts, no doubt. Then you have me there down in Chicago back in 2017 catching some Asian carps, which we do not have in Ontario's waters, fortunately, at this time. And then bottom right, you have Kate Powell, who's actually our terrestrial expert. So she's the one that deals with all of these terrestrial plants. And she gets the joy of talking to folks about Japanese knotweed and garlic mustard and all those fun species. So who is the OFAH? Well, we are the largest nonprofit charitable and fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario. In 1967, we officially became the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters when two like-minded organizations came together to form what is now the OFAH. And fundamentally, our mission is focused on the protection of fishing, hunting, and trapping as, a part of our heritage, part of our culture. And we promote and encourage safe and responsible participation, as well as champion the conservation of Ontario's fish and wildlife resources. So who is the ISAP? So within the OFAH, you have 4 core programs, and these programs are dedicated to different things. And obviously the Invading Species Awareness Program is one of those. And it is actually the longest standing conservation program, which was established in 1992. And this is actually established as a partnership between the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So what do? Well, we generate education and awareness. We focus on key pathways of introduction and or spread, which I'll talk a little bit more about pathways in a few minutes. We facilitate monitoring and early detection. So through the Invading Species Hotline, we answer roughly about 1,000 phone calls every year, every fiscal year. However, because of what's going on right now in the world, a lot more people are outside, a lot more people are looking on the property and reporting invasive species. So at this time, we're receiving about 200 calls a week. So if you do the math there, that's quite a bit higher than our average. And then we also have the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, or EDDMapS for short. And that was actually established for Ontario in 2014, I want to say. And I'll talk a little bit more about these things a little bit later in the portion dedicated to teaching you guys how to report invasive species. And then finally, as a program, we support surveillance, control, and response. Water soldier, that one species which you saw that Rob was holding, that's the main species that we try to address as a program on the ground. Because again, our core mandate, our core our core mandate within as a program is focused on education and outreach. And then we also participate in early detection of Asian carps. So through the invading species hotline, when somebody reports an Asian carp, we collate all the information. If it is a verifiable report, we do send all that information on to our partners at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as the ministry, so that they can then take the steps to go out and capture those fish. So a few definitions before we get started. As members of the public, you may be aware of aquatic invasive species or invasive species in general, but you may not know some of the semantics or some of the, some of the overlap between these different terminologies. So I just want to highlight that for you. So alien species is usually synonymous with things like introduced species or non-native species. And an example is in the top of the slide there, which is a Chinook salmon. This is a species of which wasn't native to Ontario, but was brought here and is now stocked for recreational purposes. And then to contrast that, you have aquatic invasive species, which are all the different species of fish, inverts, plants, other pathogens, things like that, which we have in our waters, which negatively affect our waters. And the real contrast here for invasives is that those are the things that are having those negative consequences on the economy, on society, on the environment, etc. Right? So a good example there is the image in the center, which is a grass carp, which is one of the 4 species of Asian carps, which we do not currently have established in Ontario's waters, but are certainly an invasive species. And given what they've done down in the United States where they're established, if they were to ever get here and become established, they would certainly have extreme negative consequences for our ecosystems. And then finally, terrestrial invasive species, which I'm going to talk about briefly towards the end of the presentation. And these are, as you'd suspect, all your trees, shrubs, insects, pathogens, which are on land, which are having, those same negative consequences for the ecosystem. So again, when you're talking about alien species, you're referring to things that aren't here or weren't here historically, but are here now, that don't have those negative consequences, versus aquatic invasives and terrestrial invasives, which are those things that weren't here historically, are here now, and are having severe detrimental impacts. So pathways, what are they? Pretty simple. I think most people can wrap their head around this, but just to kind of elaborate, pathways are essentially how a species gets from point A to point B. So how does, emerald ash borer, how did it get here? How did the Asian longhorn beetle get here? How did, Asian carps get to North America, etc.? Those are pathways. So, things like there's natural pathways, there's also human-made pathways, and human-made pathways are actually responsible for about 99% of the introductions which we have in Ontario and Canada today. Now, when you're talking about natural pathways, you're talking about dispersal by wind or water currents, things like that. And what I have pictured here is actually Phragmites, which is an invasive plant which is introduced to North America, and it's actually now found on every continent besides Antarctica. And in the early 2000s was actually deemed the worst invader in Ontario. It's found kind of throughout southern Ontario, making its way up north, and basically just chokes out riparian zones, as you've probably seen at some point if you've come in contact with the plant. And it actually likes to spread via wind, as well as its rhizomes. So those are both forms of natural spread, versus man-made pathways like what's pictured there, boater pathway, which we're mainly talking about aquatics today, and the majority of aquatics which we have in Ontario got here, usually by ballast water, but then they usually got spread inland via the boater pathway or recreational, like the angling pathway or recreational boating pathway. So as a program, we actually focus on the education outreach towards these different pathways. So, ATVers, we have things like Play Clean Go, we have Clean Drain Dry messaging, which applies to boaters, recreational, anglers, trail users, waterfowl hunters, you name it. If it's a pathway, we've done some work to try to address it in Ontario through things like social media and signage, in-person presentations, partnerships, etc. So now we're going to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the presentations. These are the species profiles. And so some of the things that you will encounter in Lake of the Woods region. So before I jump into a specific species, I'm going to actually just give you some general characteristics around the taxonomic group. Because typically when you're talking about invasive aquatic invertebrates, more often than not, the negative impacts are kind of felt the same amongst all the different inverts. Not always, obviously, but generally speaking, you kind of see similar characteristics. Same with aquatic vegetation and same with fish. So we'll kind of do the same thing there. So right now in Lake of the Woods, the confirmed species that are there that are invasive are Chinese mystery snails, freshwater jellyfish, rusty crayfish, spiny water fleas, and zebra mussels. And we'll talk briefly about these in a few minutes. And then, so some of the general characteristics that you're going to see is these things just fundamentally impact biodiversity, right? They outcompete our native species more often than not. They predate on our native species, and then as a result, affect the biodiversity of our ecosystems and our food chains. So something like rusty crayfish is a crayfish which was introduced to Ontario back in the 60s and is now hybridizing with native species, which affects biodiversity, and predating on native species, which also affects biodiversity. So as I said, most of these species are typically, introduced to Ontario, the Great Lakes via ballast water. However, rusty crayfish is actually one of those exceptions. We suspect that it was actually a bait bucket introduction. It is native to Ohio, so most likely somebody who just brought it across the border to use as bait and then released a couple, and there you have it. It's now established in Ontario. So the one profile I wanted to highlight, which is in Lake of the Woods today, is Chinese mystery snail. This is actually a very recent discovery. I mean, in the last couple months, this was first found in Lake of the Woods watershed. So what is it? It is a large freshwater snail. It does have it does have an operculum, is what it's called. So it's like a trap door on its shell. And what this allows it to do is survive out of water for quite some time, right? So it can survive out of water 3-4 days, given the right conditions. And not only that, it also has a competitive advantage since it actually gives birth to its young within its uterus, so that they actually give birth to live snails. Many snails that exist today, what they'll do is they'll lay their eggs, and then what that does is it gives other species an opportunity to predate on those eggs. But with something like this, other species don't get that opportunity because they come out, alive. So it gives it a competitive advantage. It was actually first reported in the Great Lakes region in 1931. It's been here a long time, and it was suspected that it was introduced as a food item or potentially as an aquarium release. Today you can purchase mystery snails. Oftentimes when you go to a pet store, they don't know the species that they're selling, so just be aware of what you're purchasing. They do live quite some time, 3 to 5 years, and they're actually filter feeders. So it's suspected that they filter the water very similar to something like zebra mussels. And they're also suspected to predate on fish eggs. So again, a species which is impacting biodiversity, right, through direct competition and direct predation. And then moreover, they can actually be the host for parasites. So they're called trematodes. So these things can be passed on to waterfowls like ducks, geese, etc. And then that can actually lead to the death of those migratory birds. In terms of lookalike species, the Chinese mystery snails don't have a lot, only because we don't have any native snails that reach quite that size, that bulk. The one real comparison is probably the great pond snail, which you'll see here in that person's hand. But you can tell just from looking at the Chinese mystery snail, which we'll jump back here, how wide that snail is and how laterally compressed it is. So its whorls are kind of compressed, whereas this guy, it's more elongate, so it's got a much longer shape. So just, something to be aware of. And great pond snail doesn't have an operculum. So if you see the snail and you pick it up and you think it might be a Chinese mystery snail and you take a closer look and there's no operculum, you know that it's a safe bet that it's not the Chinese mystery snail. Now, if you do find them on your shoreline, it's probably best just to remove them from the water, euthanize them as humanely as possible, and then bury them. So this, speaking about Chinese mystery snails, obviously not the great pond snail. But so if you do find them, you can dispose of them humanely, and you can either freeze them, which is probably the most humane way of dealing with them, and then just bury them in your backyard, because that way they're not going to smell like they normally do. So if you do see them, that's probably the best thing to do, but just also being mindful of the fact that you don't want to be euthanizing native species. So make sure that you're 100% confident in your identification, and the way that you can do that is actually by contacting us, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. So comparison between Chinese mystery snail and banded mystery snail on this slide here. Banded mystery snail is also an invasive snail, which is introduced from Florida. Chinese mystery snail was introduced via Asia, obviously, whereas banded is from the southern United States. And as far as identification, with the Chinese mystery snail, you're going to see those 7 to 8 whorls. And then, as I said before, that laterally compressed, shell. Now with the banded mystery snail, it's quite a bit smaller, and you'll actually see very distinct banding. Right, so you shouldn't mix up these two too often, but it does happen. I see it happen quite a bit, to be honest. But regardless, if you see a snail and you haven't seen it in the past and it's fairly large, 4 or 5 centimeters long, you probably have a Chinese mystery snail. Whereas if you see something in the water which has bands, it's most likely a banded mystery snail. There is the grove snail, which is often misidentified as a banded mystery snail, but it's actually a terrestrial snail. So if you find these in your garden and they have the banding and they're very laterally compressed, you're dealing with a grove snail, which is not a banded mystery snail. So where are they currently found? So Chinese mystery snails throughout southern Ontario, again introduced in 1931, the St. Lawrence region, and is now since kind of spread throughout southern Ontario, as well as the Great Lakes. And as you can see from this distribution map here, you see that the Chinese mystery snail is making its way up towards Lake of the Woods via Minnesota. And it has actually been found in the last little while to be in the Lake of the Woods watershed. Something to be aware of. So here are some other ones that I mentioned before that are found in the Lake of the Woods. So you have zebra mussels. Now, before people panic, we have not found any adult zebra mussels in Lake of the Woods. We've only found their veligers, which is their larval stage. So I want to encourage people to be on the lookout for adult zebra mussels. And if they do happen to find some, which I hope you don't, but if you do, you need to please report that to us, which again, reporting I'll get into shortly. Freshwater jellyfish, this one's a bit of a mystery. It's been here for quite some time, as early as the early 1900s, quite small, and kind of goes through like booms and busts, given different times of the year. So like you'll notice them kind of spring, early summer, you'll see big, clouds of them, but then all of a sudden they'll kind of die off and then you don't see them anymore. It's suspected that they're actually planktivorous, so similar to zebra mussels, they actually feed on native plankton. Also introduced from Asia. And then spiny water flea, this is one that is found in Lake of the Woods region as well, and it's kind of found throughout Ontario. It was introduced via ballast water and then kind of spread by people who just didn't know they were spreading it. They're very small, very hard to see with the naked eye. So the only time you really see them is in this image here is when you're like down rigging or trolling and you bring in your line, and then you'll see this large mass of jelly on your fishing line. And then on the far right, the rusty crayfish, which I alluded to before, the one that was native to Ohio, brought in via bait bucket most likely, and is now having negative consequences, especially in Lake of the Woods. Some of the greatest majority of reports that we've received in the last little while across Ontario has been from Lake of the Woods region for rusty crayfish. So the way you identify that sucker, as you can see in the image there, is that very distinct rusty patch. So just if you encounter those suckers, take a photograph and report it to us. So getting into aquatic plants, there are quite a few aquatic plants in Lake of the Woods region. Now, when I speak about aquatic plants, I'm not just talking about plants that are, submergent in the water. I'm also talking about those things which are kind of on the fringe, those riparian species. So, you might see something like purple loosestrife and think, well, is that even aquatic? We consider it aquatic. It likes to grow in those areas which are more wet than anything. So we consider it aquatic. So what do they do? Generally, aquatic plants, they create dense monocultures. They'll, outcompete their native species, and similar to what I was talking about before with European common reed or Phragmites, they'll just create these dense stands where they'll just completely shade out everything else, right? And that's obviously not what we want when we're trying to encourage biodiversity. So they can also threaten species at risk. There are many invasive species which overlap with distributions of species at risk. We see that in southern Ontario here, and very well could be the case in some areas in northern Ontario as well. Another big thing, they impede recreational activity. This is the one that I hear about the most from people. Folks who are going to buy a cottage, they checked out the shoreline to that cottage, found tons of what they suspect is Eurasian watermilfoil, and they don't know what to do about it, right? So it's a very legitimate question, because if you have an aquatic invasive plant which is completely taken over your shoreline, that inhibits your ability to fish or to recreate, to dock your boat or go for a swim, and it's a huge hindrance. So it obviously affects property values, right? And then, as I said before, with most aquatic species, these ones are actually somewhat introduced ornamentally. So some of them are pretty and were brought across from Europe or Asia. But then some of them were actually introduced via ballast water as well. And then intentional releases from like things like aquariums. So, there's all sorts of vectors of spread or pathways for aquatic plants. And the most important thing for people to know is just don't release aquatic plants, whether it's a pond plant or an aquarium plant. Just don't release it into our waters. That's against the law. So the species that are found today in Lake of the Woods include Eurasian watermilfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, common reed, so your Phragmites, as well as some others, which I'll show you some photos of some of them here shortly. Now I included a link here, which if people pause the video, they can kind of copy paste into their URL. And if you're dealing with an aquatic plant on your shoreline and you're not really sure what to do about it, you've identified it as an invader, let's say Eurasian watermilfoil, you can actually go to this link and it'll offer you some tips and recommendations on how to deal with that plant on your shoreline. So jumping into the profile, speak of the devil, so your Eurasian watermilfoil, this is one that was introduced in the 60s to Lake Erie via ballast water and has since kind of spread throughout most of the province. We don't see a lot of reporting coming from Northern Ontario, but we do suspect that it is there. So if anybody watching this is out on the water, they find what they suspect is Eurasian watermilfoil, please take some photographs and send it to us. As I said, widely throughout, Southern Ontario, creates dense monocultures. You have a boat there in that image that came out of the water, and just look at the density. Like, you'd have to imagine how dense that population was for that boat to pull out that many weeds, right? So, and that's actually a huge vector of spread. If you spread a single strand of Eurasian watermilfoil 6 inches long, it'll actually reroot itself. Hence why it was given the term zombie plant by Quebec in 2017, because it's almost like a zombie in the fact that you can like chop it in half and it'll keep going, right? Like you take a little fragment, you put it in a new water body, it's going to reroot and continue to grow. So since it was first introduced via ballast water, since then it's been spread kind of all over the place via fragments from boaters, anglers, as well as natural dispersal, mainly via fragmentation. It likes to grow in 1 to 3 meters deep water, so typically along shorelines, but it can actually grow in up to 30 feet of water, so 10 meters deep, and prefers those soft substrates, right? Because it is a rooted plant, it wants kind of those mucky bottoms, as opposed to like a rocky lake. You may not see, if you have Eurasian watermilfoil in a rocky lake, you may not see very much of it, except for like in back bays where you have those soft substrates. So impacts, I've already kind of touched on this, forms those dense monocultures, suppresses native species, impedes recreation. And then another thing that I didn't mention is that it can actually hybridize with our native milfoil, which is called northern milfoil. So then what you have is a more aggressive hybrid species, which is also considered invasive. Now, in terms of identification, the biggest thing is if you look at that cross section of the leaf there that I have on the slide, if you look at a single leaf, which are very feather-like, and if you count on one side of a leaf, 12 or more strands, that's actually Eurasian watermilfoil. Now, if you count less than that, you most likely have northern milfoil. So that's one of the main identifying features. Besides that, you'll also see, even this time of year, you'll see kind of like the top of the stem quite red under the water. And then in the fall, kind of like July, August, you'll actually see the terminal spike. You'll see the plant kind of emerge from the water, and that's its flower, and it'll be quite red in appearance. So widely distributed in Southern Ontario, especially, it is in Lake of the Woods region. It's not really shown that here on this EDDMapS distribution map. So, like I said, if you guys see this stuff, make sure you report it. So some other aquatic plants that are found currently in Lake of the Woods, you have curly-leaf pondweed in the top left, which actually typically will grow quite early in the season. So you'll see it kind of like early spring, really bad around your dock, and then it'll be gone, and it'll just kind of die off, and then you'll have like Eurasian watermilfoil kind of grow after that. The next image on the top left, you have Phragmites, a dense stand of Phragmites, the invasive variety. This stuff gets like 12, 15 feet tall. It's allelopathic, so it likes to basically use chemicals in its roots to make it so that the soil composition is more favorable to itself rather than other plants. So it's really good at creating dense monocultures. Then you have yellow iris, which is an ornamental that was introduced, another invasive riparian species in Ontario, which is found in Lake of the Woods. Top right, you have watercress, which is actually somewhat edible, but it's also an invasive species that was introduced from Europe and Asia. So another one to look out for. Bottom left, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this one. That's purple loosestrife. That was the one that, 70s, 80s introduced to Ontario and was suspected to be the end of, our wetlands. But, we've actually since done a pretty good job controlling that. And I'm actually aware that you guys have actually done some biocontrol yourselves in the last little while. So congrats on that. That's fantastic. And then in the center bottom, you have narrow-leaved cattail. And the big way that you can tell the difference between the invasive cattail, which most people don't even know that there's an invasive cattail, to be honest, is if you look at the two seed heads. So if you look at this plant here, the bottom half, so the the sausage-like seed head, that's the female section, and then the one above that, kind of thinner, is the male section of seeds, right? Now you see that gap, that discernible gap between the two seed pods. That's what discerns a narrow-leaf cattail. Now, there's also other ways of differentiating between the native and the invasive. Is the broadleaf and the narrow-leafed. Is the narrow-leaf, the seed pod is actually quite a bit more narrow than the native variety. So the broadleaf has a very distinctly broad seed head, and the male and female portions, you can't see any stem between those. So if you see a stem between, you're most likely dealing with narrow-leaf cattail, which is an invasive variety. And then in the bottom right, we have flowering rush, which is another species, which is riparian species, which has since been introduced to Lake of the Woods region, and it's actually creating some pretty dense monocultures around that region. So fish, we're making it through here. So fish, there's actually only one invasive fish in the Lake of the Woods region, which I'm going to get into in a second here. But generally speaking, what we see in Southern Ontario, and you guys are very fortunate not to have more of these suckers up there, is that they outcompete our native species. Things like round gobies will just go through multiple spawning events in a single season, and they'll quickly start predating on our native fish, right? Thus affecting biodiversity. So important to know though, like if you guys ever do get round gobies or other invasive fish up there, it's very important, like something like round goby, that it's actually right in the OFR, that you have to euthanize that fish. And they're making their way up there. So something that you guys need to be on the lookout for, because hopefully they never get up there, but someday through natural expansion, hopefully not people moving it, because they'd be breaking the law, but hopefully it just never gets up there. But if it does, something you need to be on the lookout for. So rainbow smelt is the only invasive fish currently found in Lake of the Woods region. Now, depending on who you ask, some people will say, that's not invasive. We like this fish. We love to eat it. We love to catch them when they're going through their spawning runs. All the power to you if you enjoy eating them and whatnot, and catching them and eating them. However, it doesn't, deny the fact that it's still an invasive fish, not native to the Great Lakes. It is native to kind of the Atlantic coast, and was brought in intentionally as a bait fish, mainly for other predatory fish, which we have, salmonids that we have in the Great Lakes. So, as I said, was stocked intentionally in the 20th century and prefers things like clear lakes and rivers. So Lake of the Woods is a perfect candidate, right, for this fish. Thus, why you have it established in that region. So impacts, just like I said with any other fish, predation, they're eating native fish. You're actually allowed to use these as bait only in some areas. So oftentimes with some invasive things like rusty crayfish, that's another example of an invasive species, which you're actually allowed to use as bait, but only with crayfish, it's only within the water body where they're captured. Whereas this guy, it's only in select zones. So what you should do is look up in the Ontario fishing regulations. If you do want to use these, just make sure that you're always, doing so within the bounds of the law, right? So in terms of identification, they're fairly sleek. They're fairly thin, long fish, minnow-like. But the big thing is that large eye and that upturned lower jaw, right? Very distinct upturned lower jaw, teeth present. So you see something like that, you're most likely dealing with a rainbow smelt, and at which point, well, you can either eat it or you can report it to us. So in Ontario, kind of found throughout the province, including Lake of the Woods. And again, the only known invasive fish that's currently in that region. So it's, again, very important that we protect Lake of the Woods, right? So here's some other fish. Now, some of these we don't have in Ontario, so I don't want people to think that immediately, like these are all things that we do have. So northern snakehead is established on the eastern coast of the US, and it's actually a stone throw away from the Great Lakes. Very nasty predatory fish, and that's the one top left. And then rough, top center, is a fish that we do have, was introduced via ballast water back in the day, and it was introduced near Thunder Bay, and then now has an established population in that region. Still fairly localized, however, and is often misidentified as our native yellow perch. Wells catfish, that's something that is regulated under the Invasive Species Act. It is a prohibited fish species that, if it were to ever become introduced to Ontario's waters, it would be through the aquarium trade or through, basically the black market of acquiring fish and then shipping fish. So this guy is illegal in Ontario. We do not have it here. It's native to Europe and is basically invaded many European countries. Stone Morocco, very similar, fish species which we don't have here, but it is regulated under the ISA. Tench is a new species which has popped up in our waters. Back in 1986, it was introduced to the Richelieu River in Quebec and has since been slowly reproducing and making its way towards Lake Ontario. So we're on the lookout for that. I know Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the MNRF are both working diligently to understand where they are currently and to try to stop them from becoming established in the Great Lakes. Goldfish, I bet you a lot of people didn't know that goldfish are an invasive fish, but they certainly are. If they're introduced to something like a pond, in an urban setting, they're certainly going to have invasive tendencies. Their populations are going to kind of boom, and they're basically going to be the only fish species found in that pond, right? So certainly an invader. They don't do too well in open water. Many native species will predate on goldfish, so they don't do that well. However, if you introduce them into an urban setting, like I said, catchment pond, something like that, they will take over that water body. And then red, which is another invasive fish that was introduced from Europe. And this one is established in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, mainly near the Welland Canal. That's kind of where it's mostly seen, and often misidentified as our native golden shiner. And then bottom left, you're probably all too familiar with this fish. Sorry, it's kind of a crummy photo, but that's actually a round goby, and that's actually looks like a spawning male. The spawning males will actually go kind of like jet black in the spring when they go through their spawning event, and that one's well established. They don't get very big, but again, because they predate so much on our native fish eggs and larvae, they're a huge impact to our fishery, our native fishery. And then finally, a zander, again, similar to stone morocco, Wells catfish, a species which is prohibited, which is not found in North America at this time, and hopefully never will be. So just kind of a mishmash of different fish species. Some we have here, some we don't. The immediate threat to Lake of the Woods would be something like ruff, which is geographically the closest fish species. Like I said, Thunder Bay, right? So jumping into some terrestrials, I figure we should try to nail off a few of these before we end. So what are they? These are all mostly ornamentals that were brought to North America, and they were brought here as a pretty plant. They were introduced to a garden or sold, and then all of a sudden they're kind of found all over the place. People didn't really understand how to control them. They're away from their natural predators, whether they were insects or whatever. And then before you knew it, you have a kind of a dense monoculture of this species, and people don't know how to eradicate it. So, they can be spread in a variety of ways, but most of the time it's because of us. It's because we planted it, or, in my case, I have European buckthorn in my backyard, and it's somebody who planted it. They wanted it, they liked it, and they didn't know what it was. So ignorance is an awesome tool for invasive species to use, because humans often don't know what they're doing or what they're spreading, and then before you know it, they're established. So some of the plants that, we have in Ontario, which are invasive, include periwinkle, English ivy, goutweed, garlic mustard, and then, some of the other ones there, like European buckthorn, Japanese knotweed, which is a restricted species, thankfully, and then dog strangling vine. So if you look on the bottom there, all the images to the far right, you have dog strangling vine, and then just adjacent to that, you have Japanese knotweed. Now, to give you an idea of what we're dealing with in Ontario, I'll show you the distribution map here in a second with Japanese knotweed, but you can see here, images of garlic mustard, dog strangling vine. They will create extreme dense, monocultures, right? They'll just compete. They're allelopathic most of the time. So again, they're creating that environment which is suitable to them, but not to other species. So they really force out native species. And then, of course, now their impact is that you get angry neighbors, right? If you have an invasive species on your property, your neighbor does not. We get that a lot, where people will call and say, I have a neighbor, I want them to deal with X species, but their neighbor doesn't want to. So, let's just all try to work together, right, to eradicate these species from Ontario. So as I said, Japanese knotweed distribution, it is found in Lake of the Woods region and was introduced as an ornamental, right? It was pretty, but it's one of the hardiest plants, and it's one of the hardest ones to get rid of. So just make sure you're looking for these things, because the last thing you want is to plant Japanese knotweed or to have Japanese knotweed on your property. Now, obviously it is a restricted species, so trying to propagate it at all is against the law. So just be mindful of these things. So then that kind of gets into like, what can we do? Like what can you do as a member of Ontario's public? And number one, and this goes like beyond anything else, is learning how to identify invasive plants, right? And invasive fish and invasive invertebrates. I know it seems daunting, but hey, like just taking a little bit of time to look through, some of our websites, like invadingspecies.com, you'll pick it up pretty quickly, because oftentimes some of these species, they'll have no lookalikes, but then some will have lookalikes. And that's where it gets a little bit challenging. But that's why we're there as a resource, so that if you're unsure as to what species you have, you can take a photo, you can send it to us, and we will make sure that we properly identify that species for you. So going beyond just learning to identify, it's really good to get into some like easy practices, right? Best management practices like, oh, hey, I'm leaving the water for the day and I don't know if there's any invaders in these waters, but I'm still gonna clean, drain, dry because then I know I'm doing my due diligence to ensure that I'm not spreading aquatic plants or aquatic invertebrates like zebra mussels, because you know, we all want to protect our waters, right? These are resources that we want to pass on to the next generation, and we want them to be able to enjoy it as much as we have. So, you know, it only takes a few simple, you know, steps to do these things. Play Clean Go is similar to our Clean Drain Dry, but it's on land. So if you're going to, you know, a trail for the day, you know, just be mindful of what you're doing, what you have on your equipment. Try to clean your equipment before you leave for the day. Grow Me Instead, especially for Northern Ontario, you know, we have Grow Me Instead guides. So if you're a gardener and you're curious about what species you should be planting or not planting, you know, go to invadingspecies.com, look up our Grow Me Instead guides, and that'll help you make your decisions, right? Like make your choices around what plants you want to plant. Don't dump your bait. This one's real simple because it's actually law. Like you're not allowed to dump bait in Ontario, right? It's just simple. However, a lot of people don't know that. And so it's really important to get that messaging across that, you know, you're not allowed to dump your bait at the end of the day. So whether you're, you know, fishing on hard water, if you're ice angling, or if you use live bait in the summer months, it's against the law. So just don't do it. And if you don't want to salt and freeze your bait and you just want to dispose of it, well, you have to do so 30 meters away from the shoreline, right? You're not allowed to dump it in the water. Never releasing unwanted pets, goldfish, you know, number one, do not release pets. If you want to get rid of pets, due diligence, look for an alternate, you know, home for that pet, you know, contact a school group, go on Kijiji. There's a number of ways that we can, you know, rehome these things without just releasing them into our natural environments. A lot of that's common sense, right? Don't transport firewood. This one's a little bit more tough for some people. They want to do it. Now, a lot of that goes back to due diligence and just, you know, trying not to spread invasive invertebrates like emerald ash borer, for example. So if you have an ash tree that's looking sick on your property and you want to cut it down, well, do so. But then instead of transporting it up to your cottage or selling it, you know, maybe burn it right there, right? Because then you know that you're not spreading emerald ash borer. So some things to keep in mind. And then finally, reporting, right? So learning to ID and reporting. I'm not going to jump into this too much. I was planning on it, but I think it'll take up a little bit too much time. I think it's important just for the general public just to clean, drain, dry, right? This kind of goes beyond that. This is some of the wording that I would give to somebody like the Ontario Provincial Police if they're wanting to actually enact some, you know, cleaning protocols within their day-to-day. But for the general public, the biggest thing is when you're coming off the water, do your visual inspection, walk around your vessel, pull those, you know, weeds and things off your boat, drain any standing water that you have, and then dry your vessel if you have time for up to 5 days, okay? Don't worry about this stuff too much because, again, it's not very applicable to you because I doubt the average Joe is going to have dedicated gear or is going to use chemicals or things like that. Okay, so clean, drain, dry. Let's all strive for that, and that'll be like a great step forward for all of us. Finally, you know, if you guys want to report, like if members of the public, they think they saw something, they don't know what it is, hey, even if it's native, don't worry about it. Send us a photo and we'll make sure that we ID it for you. That's what we're here for. Now, let's say with an ISAP, we can ID it. Well, we're fortunate enough to have a plethora of awesome experts from basically across North America who we can send these photos to get ID confirmation, right? So I've got one gentleman down in Texas who identifies invertebrates for me. So do not feel bad about sending us photos. That is what we're here for. And then besides that, you can contact us via the hotline. So that's 1-800-563-7711, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And then you can also email us, info@invadingspecies.com. You can go on EDDMapS, so Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. As I said, go on there, create a profile, super easy. They don't ask for, you know, personal information that you don't want to give out. I'm kind of that way too. I don't like giving out all sorts of stuff to the void just to receive all sorts of emails and stuff. So don't worry about that. And then finally, if you want, you can actually join our iNaturalist project. And real quick, just to close off this presentation, I'm just going to chat real quick about EDDMapS and then iNaturalist. So EDDMapS, as I said, was adapted for Ontario in 2014. It's fundamentally how we track invasive species in Ontario, right? So if you as a member of the public take a photograph of something, you report it to us via EDDMapS, we will then, like, it'll go into a queue, we will 100% identify it to ensure, you know, that our Ontario EDDMapS is credible, right? We want to make sure that every single report that's going in there is verified, because the last thing we want is people to be questioning, the verification process or questioning the distribution of these species. We want them to go in there and be like, oh, this is where these things are found, because I know for a fact that these people have done their due diligence, gone through the report, looked at the photographs, and then confirmed it with an expert if they can't identify it. Okay, so it's a great system. We have thousands upon thousands of reports. That number is actually a little bit low. We're actually well over 50,000 reports now in EDDMapS Ontario. So that's a cool resource for the public to use if they'd like. And then we also have iNaturalist. We're not stubborn in our ways, and we recognize that there are different platforms for different people. If you're more of a naturalist, you're probably more apt to use iNaturalist. If you're more of somebody who's collecting bulk data, like you're going out and looking for all the different frag stands across Ontario, you're probably going to use EDDMapS. So different things, kind of appeal to different people. So in this case, with iNaturalist, it was a project we started in 2018, and this is kind of an older image. We're up to about 50,000 reports now on iNaturalist. So just another way that we're able to keep an eye on where these species are being found in Ontario, so that if, push comes to shove and there's a species found outside of its distribution, we can report that to the MNRF and or Fisheries and Oceans Canada as part of our protocol. So yeah, so look that up, go to iNaturalist.org or iNaturalist.ca, I should say, and then join our project, and you'll see all sorts of reports of invaders in Ontario. And with that, close it out.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. We had a couple questions from members that we wanted to throw at you as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So, first off, how do invasive species impact Lake of the Woods?
So I think generally speaking, with the species that I've highlighted in the presentation today, I think you're very fortunate to start off. Lake of the Woods is very fortunate not to have as many invasive species as, say, like Southern Ontario or many of the jurisdictions on the south side of the Great Lakes Basin. So Lake of the Woods is still relatively pristine. So we need to keep it that way, right? Now, with the impacts that we are seeing, you're seeing those dense monocultures, you're seeing that loss of biodiversity, especially with something like rusty crayfish, right? The rusty crayfish that was introduced. So, as it hybridizes with native species like the northern clearwater crayfish. So they have, each species has a number of different impacts, but I think generally speaking, you're seeing that loss in biodiversity, which for an area like that, which is so biodiverse, you want to keep it that way. So I think we all have a role to play in that. So let's say you're an angler going south for an angling trip. Just make sure you're not bringing stuff back, right? Make sure you're not transporting back bait or something along those lines. Make sure that we're all doing our due diligence, whether we're going out in the field to go hunting for waterfowl or whether we're going boating. We all just need to do our part to prevent the spread so that we can ultimately protect the biodiversity of a region like Lake of the Woods.
Awesome. Next is, how can I stop the spread? You did kind of get into that already with the clean drain and all that.
Yeah, but I can reiterate, just learning to identify. Number one is learning to identify. Now, if that seems too daunting for you, if you're like, there are too many species, because trust me, there are a lot of invasive species. If it's too daunting for you, well, then you know what? Like you said, when you're leaving the water, whether it's a native or an invasive plant, doesn't matter, pull it off, right? Leave it there so that you're not transporting it elsewhere. So learning to identify is number one. However, if it's too daunting, start taking steps that, generally speaking, are going to reduce the risk of spreading aquatic invasive species as well as terrestrial invasive species.
Perfect.
We did also have a question regarding our beetle release, so I thought I'd pass it over to you because you're the expert. It was concern over releasing a biocontrol method and whether or not that would also become an invasive species over time.
Yeah, and I think that's a very legitimate question, right? It's one that we've all seen it, whether it's on the Simpsons episode where Bart takes the frog to Australia, then, introduces it, and then they introduce something else. Like there's always that, reaction to the introduction of certain things. And I think historically, we were really bad for that, right? Humans, generally speaking, were like, hey, we have this thing that eats X species, we have X species, so let's introduce it without a lot of thought given, right? Now, I think moving to modern day, I think we've come a long way with invasion biology, and we understand a lot more. And we're also more apt as a society to lean towards like the precautionary principle. So if we just simply don't know the outcomes of something, we won't do it, right? Most of the time, don't get me wrong, we have our faults. However, when it comes to something like the beetles for purple loosestrife, I think there was enough research done there to understand that, no, actually, this is a very selective beetle. Like it's going to selectively eat, purple loosestrife. It's going to enter into a predator-prey dynamic with purple loosestrife. And, to date, like that release has been going on for a number of years. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any real negative consequences as a result of that, besides the reduction of purple loosestrife populations. Now, again, like, don't get me wrong, like when you do that, when you enter that predator-prey dynamic, it's not going to fully eradicate purple loosestrife, right? So it's not the cure to the problem, but it's certainly a way to mitigate the impacts, because with any predator, whether it's a wolf and a deer, it's not going to decimate the population of what it's eating. It understands that, hey, if I eat all of this, I'm not going to have any food, right? Now, obviously, it goes beyond that. It's not as black and white as that. But with beetles, as the population of purple loosestrife declines, so too does the population of beetles, right? And then the population of beetles will get to a point where they've reached a certain threshold where they're not able to keep up with the purple loosestrife. So all of a sudden, its population will go back up. And then in turn, what do you have? Increase of beetle population. So it enters a predator-prey dynamic, right? Where the predator is always slightly lagging the prey. So basically, to answer your question, modern day, we've done a good job, I think, understanding these things a lot better than what we did historically.
Right.
And in the past, it was a knee-jerk reaction, right? It was like, hey, let's introduce this species because it eats whatever. And there was a lot of mistakes that went into that, and we suffered as a result, and nature suffered. But yeah, in modern day, we are very careful on the whole with what we do, right? Like a perfect example is in Ontario and in Canada, we only have one herbicide that we're allowed to use on the water, right? Like we're very careful with what we're putting into our ecosystems. And I appreciate that, being an Ontario citizen, and understanding that, hey, it kind of stinks we don't have too many like tools in our toolbox when it comes to things like aquatic plants and trying to treat them with herbicides. But I also hugely respect the decision making that goes into that, to say, maybe it's not good if we just spray all of these herbicides willy-nilly over our waters, right? We don't want that. And same goes for biocontrol. We don't want to be willy-nilly releasing all these biocontrol for certain species. But when there is an option, and when it is seemingly perfect and enough research has been done, like in the case of the beetles and the purple loosestrife, then hey, you do it.
Perfect. Thank you.
For sure. The next question is, if I find an invasive species on my property, should I report it? And is there a best practice for removing it?
Yeah, so best practices, very specific to different species. Most species have different methods that you want to use to eradicate them. Now, like let's talk about like aquatic weeds, for example. Like if you have aquatic weed on your shoreline, that link that I had in that one slide, even if you just Google removing aquatic invasive weeds in Ontario, that'll be the first thing that pops up. And there are rules and things that you need to follow so that you're not impacting biodiversity, so that you're not impacting native species, right? Due diligence, and it'll walk you through all of that. So in the case of aquatic plants, like it can be a challenge. Don't get me wrong. It can be very challenging. It's arduous. These things are invasive for a reason. You don't just give the term invasive to any species. These are the species that are very good at filling a niche, very good at exploiting humans, and very good at staying where they are, right? So if you're trying to take them out, you might even like unintentionally spread them a little bit. But in my mind, it's always best to conduct active management rather than not manage at all. So with Eurasian watermilfoil, you know what? Yeah, if it's on your shoreline and you see dense patches of it, grab a rake and, following the rules, obviously, making sure that you've properly identified the species, and then start pulling. Let it dry out, and then discard of it. Like discard the the biomass, right? Now, when it comes to terrestrials, it's almost, each one is different. Japanese knotweed, the management that you're going to have to put into getting rid of some Japanese knotweed is going to be fundamentally different than trying to get rid of a patch of garlic mustard, right? So what I would encourage people to do is to go on to invadingspecies.com. We have all the different profiles for many species, common species that people may be dealing with, and they can actually find the best management practices guides. Now, you know, the best management practices guides were developed by the Ontario Invasive Plant Council in partnership with us and the Invasive Species Center and the MNRF. So there was a lot of great minds that went into that. And what it does is it walks you through the biology of the plant, walks you through the different techniques that you can use. It'll tell you, hey, like these techniques will work a lot better than these techniques. It'll give you timing around when you should manage it so that you're doing the least amount of damage possible to other species, right? And also being cognizant of, you know, especially with terrestrial plants, well, you want to get at it before it goes to seed, right? So it'll tell you all that timing. Like, you know, you want to get a garlic mustard kind of earlier in the season before it goes to seed, especially when it's second year growth, right? So again, like no two species are kind of the same, but it is very important for people to report, because let's say they find one of these species, they want to report it to us. Well, guess what we're going to do? We're going to offer them all of those management techniques, right? We're going to give them the best management practices guide. So even if they're only simply reporting for the sake of curiosity to figure out what this plant is, and it does turn out to be an invader, we are going to help them by providing them with the resources that they need to then start conducting physical removal or mechanical removal or whatever is most effective for the species that they're dealing with.
In place of invasive species, are there any native plants to the Lake of the Woods area that we should be planting on our shorelines?
That's a tough one. It's a tough one only because, you know, there are different rules and regulations around the planting of plants along shorelines. So, you know, I grew up on Lake Scugog, and we know that, you know, you don't own essentially the shoreline, right? In our case, the Conservation Authority does, the province does. So in that case, you can't conduct any actual work on the shoreline unless we received a permit to do so. And it is part of the TSW, so it's actually technically Parks Canada. So that being said, you know, there are different rules and regulations around working on shorelines. So I think it's really important for anybody wanting to do something like that to, you know, due diligence, do your research, right? Contact who you need to contact, and then looking at something like the Grow Me Instead guide for Northern Ontario. So, you know, making sure that you have that conversation with, if it's the nursery that you're going to or doing your own research online, just make sure that what you're planting is A, native, and, you know, B, that you're doing this all within the bounds of the rules and regulations that we work within in Ontario, right? Because you don't want to be introducing plants to the water if you're not allowed to do so. So just things to be, you know, mindful of.
Mhm. Well, that was so great. Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed that, and I think it's really going to help our members and viewers learn more about invading species.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me, and I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Just want to reiterate, you know, if you want to call us, 1-800-563-7711, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Right now, you'll get Jordan, who we hired to give us a hand, and I actually feel kind of bad because I didn't have her picture in my presentation, but she is a superstar. She's answering the phone for us, you know, and then she's basically siphoning it down to the rest of us within the program. So give us a call. Otherwise, you can send us an email, info@invadingspecies.com. And then finally, if you want, create a profile, www.eddmaps.org/Ontario, and then start reporting that way.
Perfect. Before you go, I also want to thank our sponsors, which a few to mention are Wood Lake Marine, Q104, and the Grand Council of Tree Free, as well as all of our members for making presentations like this possible and for supporting the LakeSmart team. So,
you're a great group of people up there, so keep up the good work.
Yeah.
And if anyone else has any further questions about invasive species or just any other environmental questions, feel free to send us an email at info.lakesmart@lotw.com.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's so fun.